And I'll just kind of start by sharing the reason that we're here on this call today. We've heard from many of our clients that carbon offsets are confusing and they're unsure how they fit into their broader climate work. And there's also just been a lot of news around carbon offsets in the last year or two. So we feel like this is a timely conversation, and at Measurement wanted to bring in some very knowledgeable people to discuss it with us today. So we'll maybe give a couple more minutes here, as I know I always have trouble finding links. And I'll share, for those of you who might not know me, I'm Annie Marai, partner at Measurement. We have been around since 2017, and we help companies through many different stages of their sustainability journey. We got started with the B Corp framework and helping companies become certified. And if you're familiar with that framework, it's very broad, and it's allowed us to do a lot of different social and environmental work with our clients across over the years. We're finding more and more that there is a demand for support with climate planning and measuring emissions. We've also been helping government agencies and tribal entities do that same climate planning work as well. So with the rising demand, we want to help companies understand how they can really build out a full climate strategy and what that looks like. So today, given that we're a few minutes in, I'll explain. We're going to hope to save 15 to 20 minutes or so at the end for Q&A and discussion. So please save your questions till then. We're going to be hitting these topics very quickly, so we won't be able to dive in too deeply to them. So save your questions if there are places that you'd like to dive in deeper in that Q&A. And we are going to be hearing from Heather Schrock, Director of Environmental Partnerships at Bonneville Environmental Foundation, and she will introduce herself as she jumps into her sections. And we'll also be hearing from Eli Etzioni, Market Development Manager at Tradewater. So they are our experts today on the call that will help us navigate the complicated world of carbon offsets. And with that, I will send it to you, Heather.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Annie. Hi, everybody. I get the fun job of trying to explain what an offset is, but before I do that, I will do just a quick introduction of myself. So you know who is telling you all this stuff. My name is, again, Heather Schrock. I am the Director of Environmental Partnerships at Bonneville Environmental Foundation. We are a 501c3 environmental nonprofit. We have highly impactful programs around water, energy, and carbon with a lens of innovation and equity on all of those programs. And the part that I work on in the organization is the part that intersects with carbon offsets. I also work with renewable energy certificates and water restoration certificates, which maybe we can come back and talk about another time. But I get to what I jokingly refer to my job as running the gift shop here at BEF. I get to work with businesses and sports teams and events and conferences on their carbon, energy, and water footprint. And part of that strategy is being a retailer of carbon offsets. So I get to sell carbon offsets to these companies to help them with their own claims. It is an important distinction that we're a retailer, not a broker or trader or developer, which I'll talk about those roles in a moment. But we, as a nonprofit that's mission driven, want to work with those companies that are using the offsets for their own environmental strategies and climate change strategies. So what is an offset? Can you go to the next slide? Here we go, this lovely little graphic. So essentially, in a broad sense, an offset is, some people call them carbon offsets, carbon offset credits, carbon credits. Broadly, an offset is a way to compensate for emissions that occur elsewhere. So you have an activity somewhere that is reducing or avoiding emissions, and it is compensating for an activity elsewhere that is emitting emissions. The type of offsets we're really going to be focusing on today are what are environmental commodities or environmental products, or what would be known more specifically as a carbon offset credit. And these are the type of carbon offsets that are third-party verified, validated, registered, tracked, and then retired on behalf of those who want to use them for their own claims. But a way that I really like to think about carbon offsets is that they are a financial mechanism. And this is a way to, this is climate finance. This is a way to bring funding and money to projects that would not otherwise be funded to reduce or avoid emissions. So keeping that in the back of your mind, the voluntary carbon market, also known as the VCM, is essentially a large financial mechanism to bring funding to projects that will reduce or avoid emissions. And at the end of the day, what gets spit out and what you get to take home and put on your wall, if you want, is this carbon offset certificate, which often gets reduced and sometimes overly reduced in people's minds to, well, what is this thing? It's just a piece of paper, is what they used to say, and now they say, oh, it's just a digital or a PDF. And it's like there's quite a lot that is behind that. And that's why I made this slide, because I wanted to really help you understand that what is behind that certificate is quite a lot. So it starts with the developers and the partners and the project proponents, which are oftentimes multiple partners. Usually there is a developer. At minimum, there's usually a developer who is knowledgeable in the carbon markets and the registries and the methodologies, and there's a secondary partner who is knowledgeable in the activity itself. So for this example, I'm going to use landfill gas projects, and this is projects that capture landfill gas. So for this example, you would have the developer who might be like a large sustainability firm that specializes in developing carbon projects. They understand the registries and all of that. And then you have maybe a county that is the owner of the landfill. Now you have the methodology, and this is sometimes also called a protocol, but essentially this is the science behind and the calculation behind the carbon reductions or avoidances. So you want to line up with a methodology. There are hundreds of methodologies that already exist. They are held within these carbon offset registries that verify, validate, and track the carbon offset. So the methodology is the science. This is the science that says if you install this instrument in your landfill that will capture these greenhouse gases and maybe convert them to energy, XYZ equals this many metric tons reduced. So very, very smart people write these, people way smarter than me, get out there, scientists, engineers are writing the methodologies. And then the project is developed and launched. So say the sequestration plant is installed. If this is a forestry project, they're going to start changing their practices to be more sustainable, or perhaps it's afforestry or reforestry where they're planting. But the next two parts are vital and critical to carbon offset credits as an instrument that can be claimed later. And this is the third-party verification and validation. And it is not the developers, it is not the previous partners, it's not the registries themselves that are doing this. These are third parties that have not been involved previously, that don't have a stake in the game, so to speak. They get paid whether or not they verify these projects. So they are looking at verifying that the project aligns with the methodology, that it will do what they say it's going to do. And then once it's verified, the project can move forward. Now, validation happens after the project has been running. And this is, again, another third party that's looking at what actually happened and validates that X amount of metric tons of emissions were actually reduced and avoided. And at that point, then the registries will issue the offsets into the marketplace. And then they go around the marketplace to folks like myself, retailers, and ultimately we want them to land in the hands of the folks that are going to use them for their own claims and language, which we'll talk about later, but for their own offsets, their own climate strategy. And then they are retired, boxes checked, cannot be traded anymore. And that's where the certificate comes in. So there's quite a bit behind that PDF or that piece of paper. You can go to the next slide. These are just examples of types of offsets. I talked about landfill gas, but there's all kinds of offset projects out there: renewable energy, grasslands, forestry, REDD+ is in developing countries, typically composting, and there's many, many more than these. This is just a little high level overview. So I'll let you go to the next slide. I think it's going to be handed off to Eli now. He's going to talk a little bit more.
Yes, thank you. Passing it to you, Eli. I think you're muted.
Still muted.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah,
right.
Thanks to Annie and Measurement for having me, and thank you, Heather, for laying the groundwork there and for getting us up to speed on what an offset is. I manage partnerships at Tradewater. I've done partnerships, commercialization, and business development at 3 different climate tech companies: Alexity, doing energy control software; Symbrosia, where we worked on a seaweed feed additive to feed to cows to reduce their methane emissions; and now at Tradewater, which you'll hear more about. And we're going to cover how do you kind of separate the wheat from the chaff and identify high quality carbon offsets. We're going to talk about project drawdowns emergency brake framing, which is projects that can make gigatons of impact now, and also why you might want to take a portfolio approach to offsets that you purchase. Next slide, please. And just briefly about Tradewater, we're a B Corp and we're a project developer. So going back to Heather's framing of different roles, we do the projects and the work that prevents greenhouse gas emissions, and we generate carbon credits based on that work. We're specifically focused on collecting and controlling and preventing the release of non-CO2 gases by doing 2 different things. The first is finding and destroying legacy refrigerants before the canisters rust in that photo on the left and they leak out. These can be up to 10,000 times more potent than CO2 in terms of warming. In the background, you can see a photo from one of our warehouses in a project in Thailand where we found a bunch of this gas and took care of it. And we also plug orphaned oil and gas wells that are actively leaking methane, another potent greenhouse gas. Next slide. So now for the big question. How can we determine the quality of a carbon offset project? This first picture here is from a ratings agency called Calyx Global, and they specifically go ahead and rate greenhouse gas projects. So you can see they've shown here which UN Sustainable Development Goals the project touches. They give you a brief summary. They give you a greenhouse gas rating. And these ratings agencies are great, and I would encourage you to use those tools. But if you don't have access or you want to rate a project or evaluate a project that they haven't looked at yet, you've got to go a bit deeper. So next click, please. There are a lot of frameworks out there for evaluating quality. One of the most common ones is the ICVCM's 10 core carbon principles. I like what the ICVCM does here in breaking it down into emissions impact, governance, and then sustainable development. Those are helpful categorizations. Next click, please. UC Berkeley's carbon trading project also has an 8-question framework. And I like their question framework here because I think it's very important to get into the habit of asking informed questions when doing diligence on offset projects. And one more click, please. We also have Sustainable Lifestyle App Commons, which has a 10-dimensional evaluation framework where they bring in things like how catalytic and scalable is the project and how transparent is the project being. So all of these are useful, and I would encourage you to look into all of these. But what I'm going to try and do with our time, if you go to the next slide, is try and bring us and distill this down to 5 key ingredients that you can get a handle on. Next click, please. The first of these is accuracy, and this is one we're getting a little bit into the weeds, I think can go a very, very long way. The question here is, how is the emissions reduction or removal being done by the project being measured? Like literally, what is the technology being used to measure what's happening? Or is it being modeled? And then once you have that data, what equations are being used to calculate it? Just staying on accuracy for a sec, when I was at Symbrosia and we were trying to enable farmers to generate carbon credits by feeding our seaweed feed additive to cows, the question of how do you measure the change in methane emissions out of the cow's mouth was crucial. You can use head chambers at small scale that cows literally stick their heads into, but at large scale, that's not going to be scalable. You'll have to model it. How do you make those models accurate enough? Those questions are key for the quality of a project. Next, additionality. And this one is more unique to carbon projects, but also very, very important. And this one essentially is in the absence of carbon credits and in the absence of revenue from those carbon credits, would the project have occurred anyways? If the answer is no, we really needed that revenue from carbon credits for the project to occur, that's great. If the answer is yes, the project would have happened anyways without that revenue, then we have a serious quality issue. The kind of common example with additionality that I think is relevant these days is renewable energy projects. You used to be able to use carbon offset credits to incentivize renewable energy development. But now solar and wind power in most of the world are cost competitive and provide cost savings without carbon credit revenue. So it wouldn't make sense to use carbon credits to fund, a large scale solar project because that's going to happen anyways. So definitely want to keep additionality in mind. Next, please. Permanence is a bit more self-explanatory, but essentially asks the question of how long will the CO2 or CO2 equivalent that you avoid or removed be kept out of the atmosphere? And is there any risk of that impact being undone? For example, with a tree planting project, what happens if the trees that you planted or the forest you protected ends up burning down? Would your impact be undone? And there are solutions here and there are workarounds here, but permanence is an important frame to keep in mind. Next, please. Fourth is leakage. And this one is essentially, does the emissions reduction you create in the project boundaries by doing the project somehow cause an emissions increase outside of the project boundary? So for example, if you're doing a project where you avoid deforestation and you protect forest, are the folks who would have cut those trees down going to go and cut trees down elsewhere? And how do you kind of keep an eye on that, account for that, et cetera? And then lastly, we have co-benefits. So beyond the emissions reduction, beyond the greenhouse gas climate impact, what are the impacts of the project on the local community and ecosystem? And I think Tradewater's work plugging orphaned oil and gas wells gives a great example here. When we plug these orphaned oil and gas wells, we're keeping methane from leaking, but we're also remediating that land so it can be used for farmers. We're decreasing air pollution by keeping other toxic gases in there. And we're also decreasing groundwater contamination in the local areas. So a great added benefit of these projects and something to keep an eye on as well. Next slide. And we're going to run briefly through an example project to make this even more concrete. Go ahead. Or I'll just briefly say, sorry, if you can go back. This is a picture of our warehouse in the United States at Tradewater, where we aggregate refrigerants and bring them to the warehouse for testing and quantification and shipping for destruction. And we're going to look at one of our projects, which is on the American Carbon Registry. So next click. First, let's look at the accuracy when we collect these refrigerants. So at Tradewater, we aggregate these small quantities of refrigerant, and they come in their original cylinders. We sample them immediately when we get them, and then we also kind of put all that gas together and measure it directly before it's destroyed. So we know exactly what gases we've got, how much of them we have, and we pull their global warming potential values from the latest scientific reports. Next, please. In terms of additionality, there is no regulation requiring we destroy these gases, and if it weren't for carbon credits, there would literally be no financial incentive or economic value to doing so. Tradewater's only revenue stream is carbon credits, and so we can be very confident this work wouldn't have happened without the carbon finance. Next, please. And permanence. We superheat these gases and break them down. The end result of the destruction process is salt, a very small amount of CO2, and water. And these aren't going to reconstitute into those gases ever, so we can be assured that permanence is long-term. Next. For leakage, these are legacy refrigerants that are no longer being produced. We're just trying to track down the last of them before they leak. Us finding and destroying these old refrigerants isn't going to lead to more production of those refrigerants anywhere else because these refrigerants aren't in production anymore. So we're clear on leakage as well. And lastly, co-benefits. These refrigerants were banned in the first place because they're ozone depleting substances, and we are continuing to prevent further destruction of the ozone layer by destroying them. So there's a clear co-benefit there. So hopefully that's a helpful primer on quality. I think this would be a good moment to also zoom out too and talk. Oh, sorry, yeah, you can go ahead to the next slide, Annie. I think this would be a helpful moment now that we've kind of done that primer on quality, to sort of zoom out a bit and talk about the global task at hand and how carbon offsets fit in. At the top here, we have a quote from the United Nations Net Zero Coalition, which you've maybe seen if you're looking at what needs to be done here, which is that to keep global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, as called for in the Paris Agreement, we have to collectively reduce emissions by 45% by 2030. And that's depicted graphically on the slide here with a graph from Project Drawdown. Project Drawdown is the leading mapper of climate solutions. They have a bunch of climate solutions and the projected impact that they have. We have less than 6 years to reduce emissions by 45% to the point that the UN is asking for, and that's depicted here. What Drawdown is essentially pointing out is that to do this, we do need to scale up carbon removal projects, and that's the green line. But the vast majority of the impact is going to come from the emissions reduction itself. So if you go to the next slide, this leads Project Drawdown to what are the levers we're going to pull in the next less than 6 years to actually make that impact. And as their executive director says above, he lands on the idea of emergency brake climate solutions. So these are the fastest, largest, and lowest cost climate solutions that we can deploy right now. I think the thing that people forget when they're thinking about and conceptualizing how carbon offsets fit into the idea of emergency brake climate solutions is that even though offsets aren't in anyone's individual supply chain, like you may be supporting a carbon offset project that's outside of your supply chain, they still count towards this goal, right? If you can prevent emissions in the immediate sense, whether it's in your supply chain or not, this is a global goal. So it's going to count. And not all emergency brake solutions that Drawdown identifies are great candidates for offsets, but some of them are. So some of the specific solutions that Project Drawdown calls out that are great immediate impact levers in these next 6 years that are particularly good candidates for carbon offset projects and carbon offset credits are avoiding deforestation, stopping fugitive methane emission leaks and fugitive methane emissions everywhere along the fossil fuel supply chain, and reducing emissions of potent non-CO2 gases. If you're thinking, that sounds like a lot of overlap with what Tradewater does, you would be correct. So I think the way to bring this all together, the intersection of offset projects and emergency brake climate solutions and the needed emissions reduction, is that our job in this particular moment is to go out into the offset market armed with an understanding of what offset quality looks like and to support high quality offset projects and project types that can make gigatons of impact in the next few years by 2030. So that's sort of our mandate here and how I think we can tie all this together. We do also need to scale up carbon removal. So don't forget about that green line in the bottom right of the slide. Carbon removal is done by innovative technologies, and we need to scale that up as well. And I think that because our planet needs both these things, this is where sort of taking a portfolio approach to offsets comes in. And if you balance the kinds of quality projects you support across a portfolio, you're going to be able to make even more impact than if you just supported one project. However, what I think is non-negotiable and what the science and what Drawdown shows us is that when you're building that portfolio, emergency brake climate solutions that are on track to make gigatons of impact in the next couple of years need to be strongly represented in that. And I think we can just end on the last slide of my section by looking at an example of a company that's doing exactly this for exactly these reasons. Project Wren is a consumer subscription company that enables any individual to calculate their offset footprint and then subscribe and reduce it by supporting the Wren Classic portfolio. And I love the way Wren has put this in, and I think it aligns with everything that we're talking about. If you look at their explanation of the Classic portfolio, they say, the IPCC estimates that we need to cut CO2 emissions by 45% by 2030 and then go to net zero. We also, in their last sentence, it's imperative to accelerate the pace and scale of carbon removal. And Wren has maybe 10 different projects in their portfolio. But when you go into their portfolio and you look at the weighting of each of these projects, what you end up seeing is a strong weighting on emergency break climate solutions, right? So mangrove conservation in Mexico, that's an extension of ecosystem conservation and preventing deforestation. Refrigerant destruction from a couple different providers, actually. And then abatement of nitrous oxide, which is another potent non-CO2 gas. And then they have kind of sprinkled in there some of these innovative carbon removal credit providers, which is great to kind of maintain that balance. But I think that Wren is an excellent example of portfolio, of transparency, of vetting these projects very closely to maximize quality, and then democratizing access to that to as many people as possible.
Thank you, Eli. I think we can move on, Heather, to how do you speak about these offsets once you've purchased them and once you're setting goals?
Sure, happy to pick up here. So claims and language is probably aside from all the questions I get about the offsets themselves, the next set of questions is about what can I say and what should I say and what shouldn't I say? And I'm going to actually start with the, oh gosh, fourth or fifth bullet point there, greenwashing to green hushing. So, there's a lot of criticism of using offsets to greenwash. And, something I will say about all the criticisms and the bad publicity that carbon offsets have gotten recently is that the criticism is taken very seriously by the market and by the players in the market. And whenever there is criticism, it's important to note that the reaction isn't to be like, no, that's not true, and just be on the defensive. The reaction by the registries, the folks writing those methodologies, the developers, is to go in and investigate and actually improve. So we've got V2, V3, V4 of these methodologies coming out. So the continual improvement of the carbon offset market, it's just like any market. When cars were starting to be made, lots of people died, and they were pretty scary, dangerous things. As far as I know, nobody died in a carbon offset, but it is important to note that the carbon offset market also started with a lot of innovation and positive thinking, but certainly mistakes were made. So that greenwashing that happened in the past is also more, using the car analogy, is folks using the car improperly and then blaming the car. So that has continued to happen quite a bit, but we are seeing, I'm really excited to see some of the new stuff that's coming out that's going to help prevent a lot of the greenwashing out there. But up until recently, there was very little, oversight of what people could say about what they did. And there were certainly cases of companies using carbon offsets, really improperly, not making them a part of a larger, sustainability strategy to reduce their emissions first and foremost, and continue to reduce their emissions and use offsets for what we would call the residual or unavoidable footprint. So greenwashing certainly has a long history. And just recently, I heard this new term, which I love, green hushing, which is now, folks, because of so much of the bad PR and criticism, and companies are afraid now to talk about what they've done. And that's kind of the pendulum swinging maybe a little too far in the other direction. So what can you say? So I'll jump back up to that top bullet point. Firstly, avoid sweeping unverified claims. Seeing carbon neutral on packages and hearing companies say they're carbon neutral, I believe we're probably going to start seeing less and less of that, unless there is a very strong backbone to that claim. Even claims like net zero, a lot of companies using those types of claims without verifying and validating the claim. And there's two parts of what needs to be verified and validated. On the front end, before you buy a bunch of carbon offsets, I mean, you can certainly buy offsets and invest in those climate solutions, but just don't start saying you're carbon neutral until you have measured your carbon footprint using hopefully the Greenhouse Gas Protocol framework or something similar. So you can say, you want to be saying what you've measured, what have you not measured, put those in your sustainability reports. And then what specifically are you applying those offsets to within your measurements? For anyone familiar with greenhouse gas protocols framework, there's 3 scopes that you're supposed to measure. Scopes 1 and 2. Scope 1 is direct, scope 2 is purchased electricity, scope 3 is indirect. That's a whole nother presentation, but just at a high level, there are various parts of your footprint that you need to be measuring. Some things are more lower hanging fruit, some things are easier, some things are more challenging, and you just need to be very transparent about what you measured, what have you measured, and then what are you offsetting, instead of using broad sweeping claims. It's also important to make a distinction between the environmental solutions you're using, carbon offsets versus RECs, for example, which I talked about earlier, renewable energy certificates, which apply only to electricity usage. I have had many clients use RECs and claim they're carbon neutral, and I'm, grabbing them by their coattails and pulling them back out of that and saying, please listen to me. And then also, I didn't put this on here, but just a reminder that there is a difference between carbon offsetting as an action and carbon offsets that are verified, validated, registered, tracked, and retired on your behalf. That is an environmental product or environmental commodity that you can use against your claims. You can certainly donate to a tree planting organization or donate to philanthropically to organizations that are taking actions that are reducing emissions, and certainly there are emissions reductions happening that are not verified and validated. Those are not what you can use towards your claims. You can say you're doing that. You can use an equivalency and say this is the equivalent of this many metric tons, but you cannot say you are offsetting your footprint using those unverified and unvalidated methodologies. You really need to be within the marketplace and purchasing the products that are verified and validated to use against your claims. And then just lastly, there is a lot of new stuff. My brain was not using very good words when I wrote this this slide. New stuff. There's probably a fancier, more intelligent way to say new stuff, but that's just what I put. New stuff. There's lots of new stuff coming out in the claims and language side of things, legislation and policies that are going to that Annie's going to talk a little bit more about in a second, but that are going to dictate a little bit more clearly what you can and can't say, and we'll have frameworks that you can apply to your measurements, emissions, and offsets and other strategies for your climate, for your carbon reduction strategies. And these are just an example of some of those. VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Market Initiative, the FTC is going to come out with new green guides. California has legislation in place now requiring companies to disclose quite a bit of information about their claims and their offset purchases, and EU has also come out with guidelines. So there's voluntary frameworks and compliance frameworks, which I will let Annie take and run away with those a little more in detail.
Oh, lovely. Thank you, Heather. I think we're miraculously doing good on time as well. So nice work, everyone. So this is going to be, again, like everything else you've heard, a brief overview. These are not exhaustive lists by any means, but we wanted to pull out some of the more important or more popular reporting frameworks that we've been seeing with our clients. Really, the point to make here is that there is more and more mandatory reporting that is being written into law that will affect your business either directly or indirectly. And you can see there the top one under mandatory reporting, the Climate Corporate Data and Accountability Act, is out of California. The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive is from the EU, and then hopefully we'll have an SEC rule here in the US, but that is not written into law yet. These 3 focus on requiring companies to measure and report on their Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. I wanted to also bring up the Voluntary Carbon Market Disclosures Act, because this legislation in California does not have a revenue threshold. So this would be any company operating in California who is making goals around becoming net zero. It asks that you are demonstrating how you are reaching those goals and that you're disclosing the frameworks and methodologies that you're using. It also covers, it also requires companies to explain their offsets that they've purchased and give details around those offsets. And they've outlined that in the legislation as well. It also covers offset retailers and project developers. But this is really where having some fluency around carbon offsets and understanding what makes quality ones can be really helpful as you're building out your climate strategies, because it's becoming law in law in California that you're disclosing information around them and that you know what you're talking about. So that's a really high level of the mandatory reporting. Jumping over to the voluntary reporting side. Again, we just picked a few of these here. I want to start with the SBTI, the Science-Based Targets Initiative. That's really foundational. It asks companies to set targets in line with our planetary boundaries of warming. And you set interim targets as well, and you have to disclose and track your progress towards those carbon reductions. When you get to 90% reduction and you can't reduce anymore, that's when you neutralize your residual emissions. And that's where investment in these climate projects come in more directly in the standard. But SBTI is also really encouraging companies to be investing beyond their value chains as they go along. So that's these projects we've been talking about here. And I guess they just came out with some guidance this morning. Eli was informing us on doing so, on investing beyond your value chain, and how SBTI is encouraging companies to do that. So there's new information all the time. The new draft B Corp standards are out. The B Corp certification is going through a large evolution at the moment. There is a climate action category in the new standards, and it largely follows the SBTI guidance, so requiring companies to measure, set targets, and create carbon reduction plans. So this is a big deal for a lot of B Corps who aren't used to having those minimum standards in the certification process. And then with a couple minutes here, I just want to mention these two others. So we're seeing a lot of companies find that these voluntary reporting frameworks are becoming more mandatory for them as their large customers are requiring them to complete this reporting. For example, Costco is requiring their supply chain to complete the CDP reporting process. So we bring this one up. It's a little bit different as it's a questionnaire, much like the B Corp certification is now. And the more rigorous data collection you have on your carbon reduction and your offset purchases, the more that helps you score highly in these questionnaires. And then lastly, quickly, I'll mention the IFRS climate-related disclosures. And this is really bringing together a few of the major sustainability reporting frameworks into one. So it's broader than just climate, but they do have a specific climate-related disclosure there. And you'll probably see this more and more being used, potentially more by investors. So all of this is to say that these reporting requirements, whether they are mandatory or becoming mandatory for you, are really requiring companies to understand their climate impact on a more deep, meaningful level and understand how they're going to build out their strategy. It's really motivating this push to put a lot of these plans into place for how you're going to adapt to climate change and reduce your emissions. And these slides will be in the leave behind as well, that drill in a little bit deeper into these reporting frameworks and give you some links to follow up on. And I want to end on this note that this is from the SBTI, encouraging companies here that decarbonizing your value chain to be net zero by 2050 is increasingly becoming the minimum societal expectation of companies. So if your company is not on that track yet, that is where you'll want to start, is to wrap your head around that, how you are going to reduce your value chain emissions and your direct emissions as well. But SBTI is saying that businesses can really play a crucial role in actually helping us reach our carbon budget to reduce warming as much as possible by investing in mitigation action beyond your value chain. So we really need an all hands on deck approach. to come back to the title we posed, or the question we posed in the title of this session, should your climate commitments include carbon offsets? I think that, it really comes back to where you are in your sustainability journey as a company and how much you value mitigating the climate crisis and where your business can fall in that. We need all the support and help that we can. And like Eli mentioned, putting a fine point on those 6 years until 2030 to really make a difference. So this is why we brought up this session today. We hope that it can be inspiring to think deeper about your climate action as a company, and then also to help you build some literacy as more of these things are becoming regulated. Well, stop sharing here and we can switch to Q&A and get to some of the questions that are in the chat. And thank you, Heather and Eli, for your presentations. Before we switch to Q&A, are there any more kind of points you want to end on for the presentation, or anything we should bring up before we get into questions?
I'll just say thank you, Annie, and I think you ended on the perfect note. I think really this year, I think we're going to see the bar for comprehensive climate action be set, and that bar be set high, and it's going to involve significant internal decarbonization and accountability for any and all emissions that are remaining through high quality offsets. So I think it's all coming together in that, under that umbrella of the quote that you just shared.
I'll also jump in and say thanks, Annie, for hosting this. And looking forward and looking back at the voluntary carbon market is just such a good perspective. And looking back again, I can't emphasize enough that the voluntary carbon market was started in the absence of significant governmental action. So people have been part of this market voluntarily. And, again, just going to some of the criticisms of it, it's important to note that now that you kind of understand how complicated and how challenging it is to even create a verified carbon offset, it's not like people are in this for money grabbing. It's not hula hoops. This is a very complicated, complex product that continues to improve and continues to play a really important role in the holistic, impacts on climate change. So I think I like the looking backwards and looking forwards to how much more impactful this market is going to be and how important it will be as part of everyone's climate strategy.
Thank you. Well said. I want to start with some of the maybe more technical questions in the chat here, and please put your questions in the chat if you have more. And we may ask too as well that we can unmute you and have you explain more of your question if we're not hitting it right. Or if you'd like to speak, please raise your hand and then I can unmute you as well. I want to start with the question going back to, I think, your diagram, Heather, on the different pieces of an offset. Laura asked, in this example, does the landfill operator get to count the carbon reduced against their total emissions as well? So if I share this again here, Heather, can I give that one to you?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it actually brings up additionality, which I'll get to in just a second. So landfill gas, I intentionally use that example, and oftentimes I get to go into a little bit more detail about why I chose that example. So I can do that now. I chose landfill gas because it is a project type that in various places is more or less additional. So for the most part in the US now, landfill gas sequestration is much less additional because there is legislation in place. It is not business as usual to capture most of the greenhouse gases. In the past, when the carbon market started, it was not legislated. It was not required to capture those landfill gases. So, you're seeing fewer landfill gas projects starting in the U.S., which leads me to not only is it legislated, but now they probably, and this I actually don't know the specific answer to, but I would guess that because it's being legislated that they have to capture those gases, they probably do have to report on them. But before that, there was no legislation, no requirement to report or claim any any of that reduction, there would be no reason for them to even be measuring their emissions. There was no incentive to do that. So in this example, a landfill gas operator in the US now maybe has to report on their reduced emissions, but they're not producing offsets anymore. Whereas a landfill gas project maybe somewhere else, like in China or India, where there's no legislation and no requirement to measure or reduce those emissions, they're not claiming anything because they're not making claims, period. They're doing this for the revenue of the carbon offsets. So depending on where you are and where the project, how additional it is, a county or a city in India, for example, that's collecting their landfill gases probably isn't doing any kind of reporting or claiming. So they are not reducing, that's not getting counted against their reductions because they're not counting anything. Does that make sense? And feel free to jump in, Eli or Annie, if you want to clarify anything I'm saying. I hope that's clear as mud.
Yeah, it looks like that made sense based on that new comment in the chat there. It sounds like a company cannot sell the carbon offset if they have to claim the emissions in their report.
Exactly. Yes, that's the very succinct way of saying what I just said.
I want to move. Eli, did you have something to add there before I move on?
No, I just laughing at the clear as mud point. And yes, no double counting, just as a general headline, is a big heuristic in the carbon market that comes along with this also. Keep that in your mind as you evaluate things.
I want to go next to the question, what project types would you consider to be emergency brake solutions, emergency brake climate solutions? And Eli, let me know if there's a good slide. I'd like to have you answer that one.
Yeah, I don't think we need the slide. I think
okay.
The point that John Foley and Project Drawdown is getting at with the idea of emergency brake solutions is really just like realistically, what is the magnitude of the climate impact that can be created now and in the immediate couple of years? And first and foremost, the way that you answer that, emergency brake climate solutions are climate solutions that can have massive gigaton or a gigaton is 1 billion tons of CO2. So the way you answer that is first ask yourself, is the technology ready for prime time and ready to be deployed at scale now, or is it going to be very, very soon? If the answer to that question is no, you're probably not dealing with an emergency brake climate solution. So like a great example of using this to filter things out is direct air capture. So people are working on technology to literally suck CO2 out of the air. And that technology has made enormous strides in the past few years, and I think is important. And you can procure for extremely large sums of money, for about $500 a credit, a direct air capture credit on the voluntary carbon market today. But that's not ready for prime time now, and we need to keep investing in it. But it's not going to make billions of tons of impact in the next few years. Things that are things like the things I mentioned, like avoiding deforestation. We can do that at massive scale right now. Going out and tracking down the many refrigerants that are out there, we have the tech and the know-how to do that as well. So that would be the main heuristic, and the other one would be non-CO2 gases are great levers for immediate impact because there are these gases out there that are so much more potent than CO2 and live in the atmosphere and make their warming impact in a much shorter time period than CO2. So those can probably put you on a track towards emergency brake solutions as well.
Awesome. I want to, while we're on this topic, to go to Kara's question. Thank you, Kara, for what is the best way to find local projects to invest in? I'll leave that to either you or Heather or Eli.
I'm happy to start and Eli, feel free to fill in as well. I guess the question I would have back at you is, what is the reason for it being a local project? Like, why would you want it to be a local project? And, is it because of the co-benefits to the local community? There's reasons to consider projects outside your local area because global, climate change is a global issue. So when I have a client ask me, oh, what local projects do you have? I want to be, very transparent that We may not have something in your backyard. Carbon credit projects are very complicated and hard they're just very hard to do. And there may not be something that is local to you. So, asking yourself, well, what are the reasons for that? Is there actually a local organization that I can donate to philanthropically to make that local community impact, while understanding that carbon offsets are trying to solve for a global issue and that emissions reductions are affect a global issue. That said, the best way to find local projects is certainly just to ask several, retailers and brokers what they have, look at their portfolio, and you may luck out. I've had clients that have lucked out. They're like, that just happen to be in a town really close to a forestry project in Minnesota. And that was just by luck. But it's, as a provider, we have a very large portfolio, but we can't have projects in every single city and state and in every business's backyard. So, just reframing that to think about, what are the impacts I'm looking for locally? And do I need to achieve those through carbon offsets, or can I achieve those through another method? And also, if you're lucky, we might have something for you.
That's perfect. I was going to say, go talk to Heather or to Tradewater.
Yeah,
there are some,
yeah,
there are retailers and offset marketplaces with pretty good coverage. One of our partners, Patch, maintains a pretty large carbon offset marketplace with representation for many geographies. And we do get buyers coming to us and saying, hey, we'd love to support and make an impact in the countries where we have operations. And for a developer like us, where we're operating in a dozen different countries, that's something we can engage with. If we get questions on the minute locality level, that can be a little more difficult for us personally to accommodate, but it is still possible. And I would agree with what Heather's saying by just adding that I personally, this is just me personally, not Tradewater, not anything. I personally don't think it's worth trading off quality of credits for the specific locale that you are supporting. So, like everything in this market, it's finding the balance, and I think national level locality can be a good compromise.
Yeah, awesome. One thing I just want to mention too is Bonneville Environmental Foundation being a 1% for the Planet member nonprofit, and Tradewater being a certified B Corp are your two first hints that they are trustworthy sources as well to look at their portfolios. Any comments, Kara, on that? Any follow-up questions? Can probably unmute you too if you need help.
Yeah,
there you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
No, we were talking in the room here, just kind of repeating back what we heard, and really appreciate having both of you, Eli and Heather, come here today and help shed some light on this very complex and difficult topic for people to understand. And I just wanted to say thank you. We really appreciate it.
I want to move to the question on for the voluntary reporting, for what size companies do you recommend these? I would say that many smaller companies are being asked to use these voluntary frameworks, like CDP, for example, through some of their vendor partners or customers. So if that's the case for you and that's starting to be a requirement, or you think that requirement might be down the line based on who you sell to, especially, it doesn't just hit product producers, services as well. I would maybe look ahead for that if you have any large companies in your orbit. But otherwise, a lot of these voluntary reporting frameworks are free to use to guide your decisions. You can't make the claim that you're setting SBTI verified targets, for example, unless you go through their process, but you can use their standards for setting your own plan internally. And the same thing goes with the B Corp certification and CDP as well. You can download their questionnaires and work through them for free. So I would suggest starting there unless you have another calling to work through one of these reporting requirements. I would say if you're looking to take climate action and start to understand your emissions, there are different places you can start there as well that we didn't bring up today. If you're a small business, there are some free calculators out there that might give you a good idea. The EPA has an Excel calculator you could use. So there are different places that you can kind of start to understand your impact. And then, none of these are things that you want to engage in lightly because they do require time and resources. Laura, does that answer your question? I can let you unmute as well if you want to clarify anything. Cool, sounds like that was good. Let's see, any other questions here in the chat? Don't see any. One thing that I'm seeing from Kim is you can follow up with any of us. I don't know how much Heather and Eli are comfortable sharing their information, but definitely with me, you can follow up and I can direct you to the right source as well. We will be sharing these slides and we'll have the recording posted somewhere that you can access. So we'll figure that out after. This was really, a presentation directed because we had this demand from our clients, and it's great to see some of you here today and others in our network. So this was really meant to cater to you, and please keep the questions coming. If there are more topics that we didn't get to today that we can cover in the future as well, we'd love to hear that feedback. And thank you, Eli and Heather, for putting your info in the chat there. Any other final thoughts or questions that we have?
I think you did have one, Annie, from Alex Wick about insetting.
Oh, insetting. Seems like quite the topic to cover in 2 minutes. Yeah, any like quick points to make on that from either of your ends?
Sure. I mean, just quickly, insetting is reducing emissions within your value chain or supply chain. And it's like following the model of offsetting though by doing it. So like say you have a supplier that's providing some ingredient for something you're making, you invest money in that supplier so that their emissions are reduced. So you're not reducing your own emissions through that investment, but indirectly you are reducing your scope 3 emissions through that. And yeah, there's a lot of different ways to slice it, and it would definitely be a little bit longer of an explanation, but it is essentially, investing in reducing emissions in your supplier value chain.
Yeah. And thank you for that, Heather, and thank you, Aaron, for your comment. That might actually be an interesting topic to explore, just given your business and being in coffee. Oftentimes, companies with those agricultural value chains will consider insetting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you,
Alex.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for being here today. We'll wrap up now, and just so impressed we made it all on time here. It was a lot of info. Yeah, thank you all, and have a good rest of your day.
Bye.